Hello everyone. We've decided to make a few simple videos helping anyone interested in using traditional hand tools to know where to begin, what tools to look for, how they can restore them and sharpen them up and get to use. So the first tool we'd like to address will be hand saws. And the first thing I'd like to share is what things you might want to look for in searching for a secondhand saw that you could put to use for you. So we'll come in close and look at a few saws and we'll show you the things to look for and what things to maybe avoid. A few things to look for when you're searching old saws. Make sure it doesn't have any broken teeth ideally, and look at that the teeth are of a similar shape and size to each other, consistent. Make sure you've got all of the nuts holding the saw handle on and that the saw is fairly straight. If it's a little bit curved, we'll show you how to straighten it very easily, but a severe bend or really hard kink is something that you might not be able to fix. This is one pattern that's often seen. This is a sway back. You can see how the length of the saw is curved. Another older pattern is something like this that has a straight back, but you'll notice that it has a nib down here, which is an indicator of a good quality saw, this little decorative nib. So straight with a nib or possibly sway backed are good things to look for. Watch out, like this one is missing some nuts here, which you can replace. I'm just trying to show you how to get a saw that you can put to work fast and easily. So those are things to look for. Things to avoid would be a saw that's been sharpened to the point where it's just about gone. Somebody really enjoyed this saw for a long time, but it doesn't have too much usable life left in it. Another thing to avoid, in my opinion, is split nuts. That normally indicates a saw is quite old, and when you get back to so far in history, a lot of the older saws have inconsistently hardened plates. So you might have a saw that had really hard section here and you might break teeth when you're using it. The younger saws are generally more consistent. So I would avoid these unless you just want to collect them to have, because some of them are quite lovely, like this handle. This is also an example of what to avoid. As saws progressed, as technology changed, people started going towards a easier to produce factory job. You can tell the difference in the handle between these two saws. You can see how artistically rounded, how comfortably this saw fits your hand, whereas this one is very blocky, squared off. Generally it's an indicator of a much later made saw, maybe into the 1950s or later even. These saws that have the nicer handle, some can be dated, but you're generally looking at something in the late 1800s to early 1900s would be ideal. So architectural, artistic, curved handle, very smooth, very comfortable in your hand. That's important, and it also is an indicator that that is going to be a good saw for you. There's only a few things to know really about choosing saws, what kind you need. And they're all broken into two basic categories: rip saws and crosscut saws. And there's a lot of variation in different angles for specific woods, but to keep everything really simple and simple to understand, we're just going to go with the very basic rip saw and the very basic crosscut saw. You've got three basic terms: pitch, rake, and fleam. There's a few others like slope, but we really don't need to get into all that advanced things in this video. Basically, you've got a tooth line. Look at the front of it. How removed that is from vertical is how many degrees off of 0 degrees we'd be talking. So if straight up vertical is 0, we can call that a 0 degrees of rake. Rake is this angle from the front edge of the tooth, how far back it is leaned, or negatively would be going forward. So that's the rake angle. The pitch is how many teeth per inch we have. So for example, if we say we have a saw that's an 8 TPI, then it has 8 teeth per inch, and that's the pitch. The rake, if this is a rip saw, our generic rip saw, it has 0 degrees of rake. So the front of each tooth is vertical. Fleam is the angle across the tooth. So the fleam angle would be like this. We had our file when we're sharpening. This is our fleam angle, and our rake angle is leaning back from that vertical. So with a basic rip saw, we've got 0 degrees of rake. We've also got 0 degrees of fleam. So each tooth is very simple. It's just a very basic geometrical shape, like a triangle, straight across, straight up. Crosscut saws, on the other hand, have fleam. That's what is the major determining factor of a crosscut saw, is that it has fleam. But it also generally has rake. So this one, for example, a very basic, common angle for a crosscut saw in a handsaw would be 12 degrees of rake. So that means if I were to draw a vertical angle here, 12 degrees back, that's the rake. And the fleam, I like about 15 to 20 degrees of fleam. 20 being the most average that I use. So that's the fleam angle. So those are the two basic types of saw. Now, what do you need to look for what you can have? I would say that you can do practically everything you ever need to do with one rip saw. That's about 4 to 5 teeth per inch. One crosscut saw. That's about 7 to 10 teeth per inch. And one tenon saw that has 14 to 16 teeth per inch. And I'll show you what a tenon saw is right now. I've built the equivalent of 3 houses with essentially these 3 saws. And I would say that's really all you really need. A good rip saw like this, a crosscut saw, and a tenon saw. The tenon saw is filed rip, just like the big rip saw. The crosscut saw is filed, just as I said, 12 degrees of rake, 20 degrees of flame. This is an 8 TPI crosscut, 4.5 TPI rip, and a 14 TPI back saw, tenon saw, filed rip. First thing to do when you get your new saw home is take the rust off of it and straighten it if it needs straightening. And that might sound like a daunting task, but it's really incredibly simple. And once you see how easy this is, you're all going to feel comfortable with this, I'm sure. The rust can easily be taken off with something like an axe puck, which you should have already to sharpen your axe. Just put a little bit of honing oil on it. And I like to go in the direction of the blade. If you use sandpaper, I would advise you putting the sandpaper on a square block, because if there's an etch, you can remove it if it's not on a block. Sight down the saw and see if it's curved. If it's curved this way, for example, I put the saw down with the curve up, the cup up. And you can use a piece of chalk to mark an area. You want to have a nice, smooth, dressed hammer that's not dead flat. It has some camber to it. Put it down on a hard surface. It could be an anvil. It could be a piece of hardwood. This is just a piece of oak. And give it a few taps in a series. And then look at the saw. Sight down it. See, did that change anything? If not, tap it some more. You really don't need to be wailing on this hard. Small taps along the saw plate. Just tappa until it looks fine. Get your saw in a vise. This is one that I've made. We also have a video showing how you can also make one of these. There are some older cast iron ones like this. You can pick up secondhand. That'll do the same job, just not as well. Or you can just have 2 pieces of wood and clamp them together. But get your saw in a vise. I like to clamp it pretty low. And starting with a smoother middle file, just try to balance it so it's pretty straight across the top. And give 1 or 2 passes from heel to toe of the saw. And you want to do that till you see a flat, shiny spot on every tooth. And that just lets you know all your teeth are at the same height. This is a triangle saw file. Unfortunately, we don't make good ones anymore in the US. I do know that Baco you can find, and Grobet, I think is how you say it, are European-made files that are pretty good. Or if you're lucky enough to find some new old stock US-made files, they can be great. This is an old Nicholson that I found at a flea market that's been really good. I only use 3 sizes of saw files for all the saws that I've ever used. Everything from a dovetail saw all the way up to a big rip saw like this. And that is about a 7 regular cut, regular taper file, a 6 extra slim, and a 4 extra slim saw file, and 1 mill file that we use to joint the saw. That's all you need. You'll know that your saw is the right size. You put it in the gullet between the teeth. Try to find a file that fits the teeth with the teeth taking up half the height of the file. That's a good rule of thumb to follow. You just place the file in the gullet, press down, use your thumb on the end, thumb and forefinger on the end, and you just give consistent pushes. Now this is a rip saw, so we're going straight across, and we have 0 rake or thereabouts and 0 fleam. Fleam would be this angle, rake would be this angle. So you can just go down the saw. This big tooth saw would only take 30 seconds or a minute to sharpen. Very quick and easy. When you're done, those flats from joining should be virtually gone or gone, just, and you should feel gently with your hand as if you have tiny points or needles, very sharp, sticking up and ready. It may be a bit hard to see, but if we look at a crosscut saw's teeth and find the tooth that is bending away from us, we should see the bevels on it facing us. If we find the teeth that's facing away from us, we go to the front. For example, this and this tooth are facing away from me. So I go to the front of the tooth that's facing away from me. I place this file in the gullet and I just let it fall to that angle. See, I did that with my thumb, pressing down gently, falls to that angle. I'm watching my 20-degree line on the vise and I'm pushing. I skip a tooth and I go to the next tooth that's facing away from me and I do the same thing. In the gullet, skip a tooth, next tooth, in the gullet, push down. In the gullet, push down. See how it just falls to that angle. Skip a tooth and the next. If this were a new saw that I had never restored, the first time I sharpened it, I may choose to file straight across with none of this fleam angle here, just straight across at my rake angle, which is this angle here, to make sure all my teeth are consistent before adding the fleam angle. But if you do as I advise and find a good old crosscut saw that already has all the angles consistently set up and has not been missharpened, you should be able to just follow the angles that are on the saw by placing the file in the gullet and letting it fall to that angle. If you have to do it from scratch, a good rule of thumb is to think about if this edge of the file is vertical, and then if the top were horizontal, and find the middle between those. That's a good angle for that rake angle to be. So if I say vertical, and then there's horizontal, and I come somewhere in the middle between those two, that would be my rake angle. It should work out to be roughly 12 to 15 degrees, which is a good rake angle to have. For the fleam, you can easily measure out these lines, 20 degrees, and then 20 degrees in the other way. So we just find the tooth bending away from us, and 2 on each side. People often ask, how often do I have to sharpen my saw? And the easy answer is obviously, well, that depends. But really not that often. I've built the equivalent of 3 houses now. I may have sharpened my principal use saws maybe 20 times. Obviously depends on what you're cutting. If it's knotty wood, hardwood, green wood, softwood. But even if you had to sharpen every day, which you don't, it only takes a couple minutes when you're not talking, of course. So we come to the end of the saw, doing every other tooth. We just turn the whole vise around. And we start over. Always from heel to toe. Find the first tooth pointing away from us, with the bevels on my side, facing me. Find my angle, put the file in the gullet, let it drop to the correct angle. And we progress down this other side. Every other tooth, trying to maintain the same stroke. way down. Once our saw is jointed and sharpened, we need to set the saw. I don't always set the saw on every sharpening. I might go 3 or 4 sharpenings between sets. It depends. Obviously, if you see the saw is binding in the wood, you need more set. Set is simply bending the teeth every other way so that the curve, the line that is cut by the saw is wider than the actual blade of the saw so it doesn't jam the wood. It's a really simple process. This is a saw set tool made by Stanley. I think it's a 42X. There's a lot of different ones of these. They all pretty much work fine. You want to start with probably the least amount of set you can get by with and increase it incrementally as you see fit. If you're working in very green wood, you'll need more set. Very dry wood, little or sometimes hardly any set. As we can see, we've got a little plunging rod and an anvil that it pushes against. We just want to go to every other tooth. We can see the tooth that's pointing away. Put the plunging rod on the tooth and give it a good press. And then move to the next tooth, press, and so on, right down the saw. We progress right down the saw, just pinching every other tooth, all the ones facing away from me. I'm giving a nice little squeeze to. Now, since I already sharpened this saw, I'm being careful not to drag this across the teeth. I'm picking it up and gently placing it down each time I move it. Some people, for this reason, like to joint the saw and then immediately set the saw and then sharpen. Obviously, if you sharpen after setting, you may remove a little bit of the set because you're removing some material from the teeth. So you've got to keep that in mind. But you just go right down the saw like this, all the way down, and then you just flip the saw around. And do the other side. One last little step I like to do when finishing sharpening a saw, especially a crosscut, is stoning the edge just a bit. On the fine side of my axe puck, I just give an exact numbered set of strokes. So I go 1, 2, 3, and I do the same on the other side. 1, 2, 3, and that just, it takes off the if there's any burrs of steel. It also evens out everything, and it gives you a much sweeter and cleaner cut, smoother cut. The last thing to do after sharpening our saw is to give it a test. Cutting through some thin stock like this will tell us easily if our saw is out of tune, whether it wants to pull to one side or not, and we might want to adjust it with more stoning on that side or something. A good sharp saw should cut. It should really be a joy to use. We shouldn't have to apply force. We should have a relaxed grip with our fingers straightened off the trigger. Pretty sweet. Now let's test out the rip saw. Not bad. One other thing that I wanted to mention about saws that I've found very helpful is any saw that's 10 teeth per inch or smaller, so 10, 12, 14, 16, I find that it's better to just file them rip like this, and they can crosscut and rip just as well. And that helps a lot, with especially the smaller teeth. It's really hard to see them, and if you file them all rip, it makes your job a lot easier and faster. I hope this video has been helpful to anybody wishing to use hand tools. We're going to plan to do a lot more of these, but we'll still do our other non-talking videos as well. Please put anything in the comments that you think that I may have missed to mention, or any other questions that I may not have addressed. And thank you very much.